Hey everybody, this video is called David Did What? And tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study in the book of 2 Samuel, where we're going to look at a very popular passage that many people know about. You probably heard of it before as well. The passage known as David and Bathsheba. And so we're going to see the sins that they fall into here in chapter 11. In chapter 11 verse 1 it starts out, "It happened in the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem." And so in the Near East, kings normally would go out to battle in the springtime of the year because of many different reasons. And the main reasons why they would go out to battle in the springtime is because the weather starts getting nicer in the spring, as well as you see an increase in the abundance of food available along the way. And we see here, though, that David, he dispatches Joab, his army commander, with his mercenary soldiers and the army of Israel to continue the battle against Ammon that begun the previous year. And remember that Rabbah was the Ammonite capital that was about approximately 24 miles east of the Jordan River, opposite of Jericho. And Abishai in the previous year defeated the Ammonite army in the open country, after which the remaining Ammonites fled behind the walls of the city of Rabbah for protection. And Joab, he returned the next year to besiege the city. Staying home in such situations was also not David's typical practice. And staying home from the battle provided opportunity for the long-standing lack of romantic restraint to display itself. We're going to see that David's going to get himself into some deep water in the upcoming verses. In verse 2 it says, "Then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold." And I know some of you men would be saying, what a lucky guy and everything right here. But David was not a lucky guy in this circumstance. In the higher elevation of the palace roof, it allowed David to see into the courtyard of the nearby house. And when he's looking into this courtyard of the nearby house, he's looking at a beautiful woman at this time period named Bathsheba. And that same roof later in the book of 2 Samuel becomes significant as it becomes the scene of other sinful immoralities that we're going to find in the upcoming chapters. And I have little doubt that Bathsheba was 100% innocent in this. And I believe that Bathsheba was dressed in modesty to really draw David's attention more. And I have little doubt that Bathsheba wasn't as much blame as David. But regardless, David is not justified in his actions here for his sin. His sin was not seeing Bathsheba. It wasn't because he looked over and saw her. It was because he kept staring at her after the scenery came upon his eyes. He decided to linger on viewing what he saw. And David, we know David lived a polygamous lifestyle. We know that he had many wives, and what we see here is that the many wives did not satisfy his lust. He is now lusting after this woman Bathsheba, and you cannot satisfy lust of the flesh. And some people might be like, if I had another wife or another woman, a concubine, and I could release my sexual failings out because my wife doesn't want to do anything, they think that life would be better. But honestly, throughout the Bible, we don't see that. And David's an example of that. And Bathsheba indeed had great beauty, which did not help the temptation of David. But lust is not a mind issue, it is a heart issue and a mind issue that one faces when facing temptation. And in verse 3, it says, "So David sent and inquired about the woman, and someone said, 'Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?'" So now we see in verse 3 that Bathsheba's name, we will not see it again up until the next video. And we see that Bathsheba is a married woman. She is married to Uriah. And Eliam was the father of Bathsheba and one of David's mighty men. And Bathsheba was Ahithophel's granddaughter. And this could explain why Ahithophel was one of David's counselors later. And we see that he's going to give his allegiance to the rival king Absalom and his revolt against David. And Uriah was also one of David's mighty men who was known as a Hittite. And Uriah in the Hebrew meant "the Lord is my light," or it indicates that he was a worshiper of the one true God. And in taking Bathsheba, David did not just sin against Bathsheba and himself, but David, taking Bathsheba into the form of adultery, he sins against her husband, ultimately, her father and her grandfather, who was close to him. In verse 4 says, "Then David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him. And he lay with her, and she was cleansed from her impurity, and she returned to her house." In verse 4, these terms are substitutive references to sexual intercourse, because it says here that she came and lay. And it was like said back in Genesis 19 verse 34 with Lot's daughter, when it said that she went to go lay with her father. In this verse, it indicates that David and Bathsheba were guilty of adultery. And that's why I said earlier that I don't believe that Bathsheba is a victim. She acted out as well within the sin. And I believe she was acted in modesty. And her recent days had involved menstruation and the required ceremony of purification that we looked at back in Leviticus chapter 15, verse 19 through 30. And they were followed by adulterous intercourse. And the fact that she had just experienced her period makes it plain that Bathsheba was not pregnant by Uriah when she came to lie with David. And we're going to see that, a little spoiler alert, that Bathsheba is going to become pregnant. And you might be thinking in your BC days, if you watch Jerry Springer, this chapter kind of reminds you of those crazy stories. But to be honest here, if I can be blunt, I believe that David was thinking with the wrong head. He was not thinking in the mind of the Spirit. And he was acting out in his flesh desire. He was letting his flesh control him. And one thing we must realize when we talk about sin is that sin is fun for a season. If sin wasn't fun, we would not be looking to sin. But sin, while it is fun, it is a costly fun. It is going to cost you greatly. And in the upcoming chapter in tomorrow's video, we're going to see that it cost David significantly. And I wonder if David only could foresee the future, if he knew what it was going to cost, would he have continued staring at her and make that move to get with her? And it brought an unwanted pregnancy, as we see, and we're going to see that it brings the murder of her husband, who was also a trusted friend. And not just that, after Uriah is killed, we're going to see in the next chapter that it's going to bring a dead baby. And his daughter is going to be raped by his son, and a son who imitated David's lack of self-control. And we're going to see that it leads him and much of Israel away from God. So we're going to see this sin have a huge effect on the upcoming chapters and the family of David. And David, he lived as the world's understanding of sex. And David, in this chapter, when he was thinking with the wrong head, he was thinking of sex as something pleasurable, as a pleasurable experience. And he did not think of it the biblical, God's defining way of being a personal bond between one husband and one wife relationship. In verse 5 it says, "And the woman conceived, so she sent and told David and said, I am with child." And, I am with child, as we read in verse 5, she's pregnant. She recognizes that she's not pregnant, with a clump of cells in her belly. She is pregnant with a child. And, that's why I believe that abortion is murder, because it is a child that is in the womb. The word for fetus, it means unborn human. But to stay on track, what my notes have here is the only words of Bathsheba recorded concerning this incident acknowledged the resultant condition of her sin, which became evident by her pregnancy and was punishable under the Mosaic law by death, as we saw back in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, and Deuteronomy 22:22. In verse 6 through 11, it says, "Then David sent to Joab, saying, Send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. And when Uriah had come to him, David asked how Joab was doing, and how the people were doing, and how the war prospered. And David said to Uriah, Go down to your house and wash your feet. So Uriah departed from the king's house, and a gift of food from the king followed him. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. So when they told David, saying, Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, Did you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? And Uriah said to David, The ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents, and my lord Joab and his servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink, and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing." So at this point, you're probably like, whoa, what is happening with this? And this is a foolish conversation, was a ploy to try to cover the damage that David had did. He tries to ploy Uriah to come home and to have sexual intimacy with his wife, to kind of make it look evident that her pregnancy could be of Uriah and not David. And David, he's trying to hide the consequences of his sin so that it would appear that Uriah had fathered the child, and therefore sparing David the public shame that would come upon a man in this situation. And it would also prevent Bathsheba from facing the potential death penalty. And sorry, David, on a side note, this would not save you from the Maury show back in the 90s. This story is just like, it goes way beyond my mind. Like, it's crazy to see this type of story in the Bible. But this shows us the true condition of man, and even can be the condition of a man after God's own heart. And it shows that there is still a flesh and a spiritual battle within us. And we see that in the book of Galatians and Ephesians. And since the washing was before going to bed, the idiom, it means to go home and go to bed. And to a soldier coming from the battlefield, it said boldly to enjoy your wife sexually. And hopefully David's meeting with Bathsheba would be masked by Uriah's union. And we see that the gift of food was designed to help Uriah and Bathsheba enjoy their evening together. And so often we don't like the consequences of our sin, and we try to make it look worse, look not as bad as it is. And, he's wanting this to be a loyal example to his soldiers who were still in the field. But we see that Uriah did not take advantage of the king's less than honorable honor. And good for him. He's not going to follow a order from someone that's immoral here. And the Ark of the Covenant was residing in either the tent in Jerusalem or the tent of the army of Israel on the battlefield out of the not so comfortable text. And a positive thing to note here that may be missed is that it shows Uriah had a passion for the glory of God, even though he was a Hittite and not a native Jew. In verse 12 and 13 says, Then David said to Uriah, Wait here today also, and tomorrow, and I will let you depart. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. Now David called him, and he ate and drank before him, and he made him drunk. And at evening he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of the Lord. But he did not go down to his house. And so, verse 12 and 13, David, he lied to Uriah, knowing that he wanted to get back to the battlefront as soon as possible. And failing in his first attempt to cover up his sin, we see that David was unsuccessful to make Uriah drunk so that he would lose his resolve and self-discipline and return to his home into his wife's bed. And some theologians believe that Uriah suspected some infidelity between Bathsheba and David and avoided her out of jealousy. In verse 14 through 17, in the morning it happened that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter saying, Set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle and retreat from him, that he may be struck down and die. So it was while Joab besieged the city that he assigned Uriah to a place where he knew that they were valiant men. Then the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the people of his servants of David fell, and Uriah the Hittite died also. So, failing twice to cover up his sin with Bathsheba, we see that David becomes frustrated and he panics. And we see now that he's going to plot the murder of Uriah by taking advantage of Uriah's unswerving loyalty to him as king. Even as Uriah, he would deliver his own death warrant. And therefore, David engaged in another crime that was deserving of capital punishment, as we see back in the book of Leviticus 24, verse 17. And we see here, it's a graphic proof of the extremes that people will go in their pursuit of sin and in the absence of restraining grace. And David, he commanded Joab to arrange Uriah's death. And Joab did exactly what David had commanded, and we see that he had murdered Uriah. And David allowed temptation to turn into lust, and that lust led him into adultery. And when the consequences of that adultery threatened to expose a sin, we see that he covers it up with a deceptive practice. And then when that did not work, he had her husband murdered. In sin, what we must realize is that sin will take you further than you're willing to go. And it's going to cost you more than you're willing to want to pay. And that's what we must keep in mind before we decide to follow through with a temptation of ours. In verse 18 through 25 says, Then Joab sent and told David all the things concerning the war, and charged the messenger, saying, When you have finished telling the matters of the war to the king, if it happens that the king's wrath rises, and he says to you, Why did you approach so near to the city when you fought? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who struck Abimelech, the son of Zerubbesheth? Was it not a woman who cast a piece of the millstone on him from the wall, so that he died in the Bez? Why did you go near the wall? Then you shall go, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So the messengers went and came and told David all that Joab has sent to him. And the messenger said to David, surely the men prevailed against me and came back to us in the field. Then we drove them back as far as the entrance of the gate. The archers shot from the wall at your servants, and some of the king's servants are dead. And your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. And then David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this thing displease you, for the sword devours one as well as another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, so encourage him. And so, verse 18 through 25, we see that he sent a messenger with a veiled message to tell David his wish had been carried out. And Joab must have known the reason behind the otherwise stupid military deployment. And David hypocritically expressed indifference to those who died, and he comforted Joab, authorizing him to continue the attack against Raman. In verse 26-27, to wrap up the chapter, it says, when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah her husband was dead, she mourned for her husband. And when her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife to bore him a son. But the thing that David had displeased the Lord. So the customary period for mourning, as we see back in the book of Genesis 50, verse 10, and 1 Samuel 31, verse 13, is the 7 days as seen in Genesis 50, verse 10, and 1 Samuel 31, verse 13. And significantly, this text, it makes no mention of mourning by David displeased the Lord, means it was evil in the eyes of the Lord, and it would bring forth evil consequences. And David simply added her as another wife. And this is the first mention of God in this chapter, if you haven't noticed. And God did not miss anything. God did not learn anything through this. And so, to wrap up here, we look today at David staying home from the war against the Ammonites. And we saw then that David encountered temptation. And one thing I would like to mention with the men is men ought to exercise self-control. As men, we need to be able to, when we see something that's going to really make our hearts turn against God, we need to be able to look the other way. We need to be able to do a about face, a 180 turn, and go the other direction. And maybe if you struggle with lustful thoughts, maybe you need to eliminate yourself at the beach and all that down at the ocean or the lake or whatever the case might be. But at the same time, in our wrap-up, I want to mention that the ladies must never contribute as an occasion for sin in others. Ladies, you should not be a stumbling block for men. And that is even in how you dress. And I know that might make somebody uncomfortable. They might call me sexist, not modern day, whatever the case is. Fourth, we're going to look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9. 1 Timothy 2:9 says, in like manner also, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. And so I know that obviously we probably don't practice some of that directly today, but what I want to get out of it is that you should be considerate in what you are revealing on your body. You need to keep your body for your spouse to be able to see only. And I know some are going to accuse me of being legalistic by bringing that up and all that, but that is what God's word says, and I know it's not cared about in the modern day society. And men, your verse, let's go over to Galatians chapter 5, verse 16. You might have thought I was going to take it easy on us men, but this is, a challenge for everybody. In Galatians 5:16 it says, I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. In verse 17, for the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. In verse 19, now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, and selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envies, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I also told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. And if David would have had put his attention where God wanted it, he would never have put it where God did not want it. And as men, we need to keep in mind that we must walk in the Spirit. We must walk with God, and we need to have self-control. And men need to learn to never let their eyes or mind rest on attractive images except for what belongs to them in marriage. And we must have the discipline to bounce our eyes when something perverted is in front of us and images that come into our sight. And when we fail to walk in the Spirit, we will give in to temptation through the heart and mind. And Joseph was more severely tempted to commit sexual immorality than David was here. But we see that Joseph, he fled the temptation in Genesis. And we witness that David pursued the temptation, and we saw that he embraced the temptation. And then we see that Bathsheba had some unwanted news for David, that she was going to have his baby. And then we see that David, he goes off the deep end trying to undo something that was already too late. He goes off the deep ends and attempts to cover his sin by having her husband murdered because her husband did not want to play out the story that he wanted painted. And the whole concept of hiding your sin is deceptive. There is no such thing as hiding your sin. You might be able to hide your sin from your spouse. You might be able to hide your sin from your pastor. You might be able to hide your sin from your friends, and so on and so forth. But God sees everything. And hidden sin isn't just seen by God, but when you hide your sin and you don't deal with sin in your life, it's going to come between you and God as a wall. It's going to affect your fellowship and your relationship with God. And it's also going to play out in your relationship with others. And the right thing to do with hidden sin is to come out and to be open in confession and repentance. And we saw a second attempt to cover his sin fails. And we saw that David sent Uriah to battle with his own death sentence in hand. And when sin goes unconfronted, one sin can take a wretched course. And this is exactly shows today in our study of 2 Samuel with David and Bathsheba, what happens when sin goes undealt with, unconfronted. And we saw that Joab reported back to David of Uriah's death. And we see that David then married Bathsheba, and then they went on to be a family. And as I mentioned, when we have undealt with sin, it's going to take you to places you weren't planning to go. For instance, you might start out with a alcoholic beverage with your friends at the bar or whatever else, you know. Obviously, you're not wearing your cross and your Christian t-shirt, most likely. But you're just going out for occasional drinks. And then you go out for that drink, and your friends tell you to just keep downing them, keep downing them. You leave the bar, and you get some Fireballs or whatever other type of liquor, and you get really roasted. And you know that you've had too much to drink, you should not be driving, so on and so forth. And now you're drunk, you're going to get in the car, you're going to start up that car and drive home, maybe with your friends, maybe by yourself. And while you're driving home, home's only 2 miles away. What do you got to worry about besides maybe cops or a DUI checkpoint? Well, now you're going on the roadway at 40 miles an hour, 50 miles an hour, and you drive into another vehicle, an innocent bystander on the roadway or pedestrian, and now they die. You know, your sin of not controlling your flesh into alcoholism or drunkenness now has made you a manslaughter subject, or a killer. You made actions, you took actions in sin that made you go further than you would want to do. You might never dream before that you would never kill somebody, but now here you are in that type of circumstance. And that is why it's important to deal with sin straightforward. And we're going to wrap up our video here. It is a very long video, and we'll see you next as we're going to look at David being confronted. And it gets great. I love Nathan and his boldness with David. But I hope you have a great rest of your evening. We'll see you back tomorrow night. Thank you for hanging in there. God bless.